Welcome to Fright Club. The first rule of Fright Club is you do talk about Fright Club. Based on true events. The Finder. Mike Torrance had been living with his gift for 34 years. And he still didn't have a name for it that didn't make him sound like some crystal-gazing fraud on a late-night TV infomercial. Psychometry was what the books called it, but that sounded like something you'd measure with calipers. Object reading was more accurate, but made him think of fortune tellers with painted fingernails and too much mascara. What Mike could do was simple enough to describe and impossible to explain. He could touch something and see where it had been. Not all the time, and not with everything, seemed to work best with objects that meant something to someone. Things that had been handled with emotion, held close, worried over. The stronger the feeling attached to the object, the clearer the vision. It had started when he was 8 years old, and his mother was tearing the house apart, looking for her wedding ring. She'd taken it off to knead bread dough, set it somewhere safe, and then completely blanked on where somewhere safe was. Mike had found her crying at the kitchen table, her hands still dusted with flour. "It's okay, Mama," he'd said, taking her hand. "I'll help you look." But when his small fingers closed around hers, he saw it clear as day. The ring sitting on the windowsill above the kitchen sink, where the late afternoon sun made the small diamond sparkle like a star. He'd seen her put it there, watched her glance around the kitchen to make sure it was somewhere she'd remember, seen her satisfied nod before she went back to her bread. "Try the windowsill," he'd said, and his mother had stared at him for a long moment before walking over and finding the ring exactly where he'd said it would be. "How did you know that, Michael?" He couldn't explain it then, and he couldn't explain it now. The gift, if that's what it was, had been with him ever since. Sometimes it was clear as watching a movie. Sometimes it was just flashes, fragments, like looking through a kaleidoscope. And sometimes, when he was tired or stressed or had been drinking too much, it didn't work at all. Which was why he'd never made a career out of it. Mike Torrance was a handyman in Castle Rock, Maine, a divorced father of a teenage daughter who thought he was an embarrassment, a man who drove a 15-year-old Ford pickup and lived in a rented apartment above Needful Things antique shop. He fixed leaky faucets and rewired faulty outlets and helped old ladies move their furniture. And occasionally, very occasionally, he used his gift to help people find things that mattered to them. Always quietly, always carefully, and always for free. Like last month when Mrs. Chen couldn't find her husband's Purple Heart. Her Arthur had been dead for 3 years, but she'd been cleaning house for her daughter's visit and somehow misplaced the metal case. Mike had touched Arthur's favorite coffee mug and seen the old man hiding the case in the basement behind his workbench, wrapped in an oiled cloth to keep it safe from humidity. Sometimes, Arthur liked to go down there and just hold it, Mrs. Chen had said when Mike led her to it. Especially toward the end, when the memories were all he had left. Mike never asked for payment, but people had their ways of showing gratitude. Mrs. Chen brought him homemade soup once a week. Old Pete Morrison let him use the garage bay for free when the truck needed work. Sarah Bracknell from the diner always made sure his coffee cup stayed full and never charged him for pie. It was a good life, Mike told himself. Quiet, predictable, honest. The kind of life a man could live without explaining himself to anyone. Until Emma Hutchins went missing. The call came on a Tuesday morning in October when the leaves were just starting to turn and there was that first sharp bite in the air that promised winter wasn't far behind. Mike was replacing a garbage disposal for the Perkins family when his cell phone buzzed. "Mike, this is Linda Hutchins, Emma's mother." Mike knew Linda by sight, a young woman who worked at the bank, always looked tired, raising her daughter alone after her husband had taken off for parts unknown 2 years back. Emma was 7, gap-toothed and fearless, the kind of kid who climbed trees and caught frogs and wasn't afraid of anything. "What can I do for you, Linda?" Her voice cracked. "Emma didn't come home from school yesterday. The police, they're looking, but it's been almost 18 hours, and they don't have any leads, and I just thought, I heard you help people sometimes. Find things." Mike's stomach went cold. He'd helped find lost jewelry, missing pets, important documents. Never a missing child. Never anything that mattered this much. "Linda, I'm not sure I can—" "Please." The word came out broken, desperate. "I don't have anyone else to ask. My parents are dead, Emma's father is God knows where, and the police keep telling me to be patient." "I can't be patient, Mike. She's my baby." Mike closed his eyes. Through the phone, he could hear Linda crying, trying to muffle the sounds with her hand. In the background, he heard voices, probably neighbors or friends, people who'd come to sit with her while she waited for news that might never come. "Where are you now?" he asked. "Home. 47 Maple Street. I'll be right over." The Hutchins house was a small Cape Cod in the older part of town, the kind of place where young families started out and old folks stayed until they couldn't manage the stairs anymore. Mike had driven past it 1,000 times, but never really looked at it. Now he saw the small details, the carefully maintained flower beds, the swing hanging from the old oak in the front yard, the child's bicycle leaning against the front porch. Linda met him at the door. She was maybe 35, brown hair pulled back in a ponytail, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt that looked like she'd slept in them. Her eyes were red-rimmed and desperate. "Thank you for coming," she said, leading him into a living room that looked like it had been decorated on a tight budget, but with a lot of love. Family pictures covered the mantelpiece. Linda and Emma at the beach, at Christmas, blowing out birthday candles. A normal life suddenly torn apart. "Tell me what happened," Mike said, settling into a chair across from the couch where Linda perched on the edge of the cushions, too wired to relax. "Emma walks home from school every day. It's only 4 blocks, and she's done it since kindergarten. She knows to come straight home, knows not to talk to strangers." Linda twisted her hands in her lap. "She was supposed to be home by 3:30. When she wasn't here by 4, I called the school. They said she'd left with everyone else. Did anyone see her after that? Mrs. Donovan, from 2 streets over, saw her at the corner of Maple and Pine around 3:40. Emma waved at her. That was the last—" Linda's voice broke again. Mike leaned forward. "Linda, I need you to understand something. What I do, it's not like in the movies. I can't just wave my hand and know where Emma is. I need something that belonged to her, something she handled a lot, cared about. And even then, I might not see anything useful. But you'll try?" "Of course I'll try." Linda nodded and hurried upstairs. Mike could hear her moving around, probably going through Emma's room. While he waited, he studied the family pictures more closely. Emma looked like her mother, the same brown hair and serious eyes, but there was something else in the child's face, a spark of mischief that suggested she was the kind of kid who would climb the highest tree just to see if she could. Linda came back downstairs carrying a stuffed rabbit that had seen better days. The fur was worn smooth in places. and one ear was slightly shorter than the other where it had obviously been loved back to health more than once. "This is Mr. Hopscotch," Linda said, holding the rabbit carefully. "Emma's had him since she was 2. She sleeps with him every night, takes him everywhere. When she started school, I had to convince her to leave him at home because the other kids might make fun." Mike took the rabbit and immediately felt the weight of emotion attached to it. 7 years of bedtime stories, whispered secrets, tears dried against soft fur, and the fierce love only a child could feel for a treasured toy. This would work. This would definitely work. "I need you to understand," Mike said, holding the rabbit but not yet opening himself to whatever it might show him. "Sometimes what I see isn't pleasant. If something bad happened to Emma, I might see it. Are you prepared for that?" Linda's face went white, but she nodded. "I have to know. Not knowing is killing me." Mike closed his eyes and let his fingers tighten around Mr. Hopscotch. The vision hit him like a physical blow. Emma walking down Pine Street, her school backpack bouncing against her shoulders, Mr. Hopscotch tucked under one arm. She was humming something, sounded like a song from one of those Disney movies kids loved. Happy. Safe. Just a little girl walking home from school on a beautiful October afternoon. Then a van pulled up beside her. White van, no windows in the back, the kind contractors used. The driver leaned out, saying something to Emma. Mike couldn't hear the words, but he could see Emma's face change from casual interest to confusion to fear. The man got out of the van, mid-40s maybe, average height, thinning brown hair. The kind of face you'd forget 5 minutes after meeting him. He was holding something, a piece of paper, like he was asking for directions. Emma stepped closer, still clutching Mr. Hopscotch, wanting to help but smart enough to be cautious. Too cautious. When Emma tried to back away, the man grabbed her arm. She opened her mouth to scream, but he clamped his other hand over her face. In the struggle, Mr. Hopscotch fell to the pavement. Mike felt Emma's terror through the rabbit, felt her desperation as she was dragged toward the van. She was fighting, kicking, trying to bite the hand covering her mouth. But she was 7 years old and maybe 60 pounds, and the man was strong. The van door slammed, the engine started, and Mr. Hopscotch lay abandoned on the asphalt, soaking up the last traces of Emma's fear and love. Mike's eyes snapped open. He was sweating, his heart hammering against his ribs. Linda was staring at him with a mixture of hope and dread. "What did you see?" Mike set the rabbit down carefully, his hands shaking. She was taken. A man in a white van, no back windows. He grabbed her on Pine Street about 2 blocks from here. Linda's face crumpled. "Is she was alive when he took her," Mike said quickly. "Fighting mad, actually. That's a good sign. Emma's a fighter. Did you see where he went?" Mike closed his eyes again, trying to pull more from the vision, but it was fading the way they always did. No. The connection broke when she was put in the van. "I'm sorry." Linda was crying again, but there was something different in her tears now. Relief, maybe, at finally knowing what had happened. Or maybe just the release of having her worst fears confirmed. "We have to call the police," she said. "Tell them about the van." Mike nodded, but he was thinking about something else. In all the years he'd been using his gift, he'd never felt anything like what he'd experienced touching Mr. Hopscotch. Usually, the visions were like watching a movie, clear but distant, something happening to other people. This time, he'd felt Emma's fear as if it were his own, felt her desperation and terror and the fierce love she had for the stuffed rabbit she'd been forced to leave behind. And there was something else, something that made his skin crawl. For just a moment, right at the end of the vision, he'd felt something looking back at him. Something that had noticed his presence in Emma's memory and didn't like being watched. The police came and took Mike's statement with the kind of polite skepticism he'd expected. Detective Ray Torgerson was a good man, Mike knew. They'd gone to high school together, played on the same baseball team. But Ray dealt in facts and evidence, not psychic visions from stuffed animals. "You're sure about the van?" Ray asked, pen poised over his notebook. "White panel van, no rear windows," Mike repeated. "The driver was maybe 45, brown hair, average build, nothing distinctive about him." "And you saw this how, exactly?" Mike had worked out his story in advance. "I was driving home from the Perkins place around 3:30. Saw a white van parked on Pine Street. Thought it was odd because I didn't recognize it. When Linda told me that's where Emma was last seen, I remembered. It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the truth either." Ray made his notes, promised to put out a bolo for white panel vans, and left with the kind of expression that said he wasn't holding out much hope. Linda walked Mike to the door. "What happens now?" "The police will do their job," Mike said. "They're good at what they do. But you'll keep looking too, won't you? With your gift?" Mike hesitated. Every instinct told him to walk away, to let the professionals handle this. What he'd felt at the end of that vision, the sense of something looking back at him, had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. But when he looked at Linda's face, saw the desperate hope in her eyes, he found himself nodding. "I'll do what I can." Mike went home to his apartment above the antique shop, but he couldn't settle down. He tried watching TV, tried reading, tried organizing his toolbox, anything to keep his mind occupied. Nothing worked. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Emma's face in that moment when she realized she was in trouble. Finally, he gave up and drove back to Pine Street. The section of road where Emma had been taken was just an ordinary piece of suburban asphalt. Modest houses, well-kept lawns, the kind of neighborhood where people knew each other's names and kept an eye on each other's kids. The kind of place where a child should be safe walking home from school. Mike parked his truck and walked to the spot where he'd seen Emma in the vision. There, at the edge of the pavement, he found what he was looking for, a small scuff mark in the asphalt where Mr. Hopscotch had hit the ground. He knelt and placed his palm flat against the pavement. This time, the vision was different, broader. He saw the van pulling away, saw it turn left onto Elm Street, then right onto Route 117 heading out of town. He followed it in his mind, watching the landscape change from suburban streets to rural highway to nothing. The connection broke, leaving him kneeling on Pine Street with a splitting headache and the taste of copper in his mouth. But he'd seen enough. The van had left Castle Rock heading north on 117. That was something, at least. Mike was about to get up when he felt it again, that sense of being watched. But this time, it wasn't coming from a vision. This time it was immediate and present and very real. He turned slowly, scanning the street. Most of the houses were dark, their occupants either asleep or watching TV in back rooms. But there, in the shadow of a large maple tree 3 houses down, Mike saw the outline of a figure, a man standing perfectly still, watching him. Mike's heart began to race. He stood up slowly, not taking his eyes off the shadowy figure. For a long moment, they stared at each other across the quiet street. Then the figure stepped backward, deeper into the shadows, and disappeared. Mike ran to the spot where the man had been standing, but found only an empty sidewalk and the lingering smell of cigarette smoke. Whoever it was had vanished into the maze of backyards and side streets that made up this part of town. But as Mike walked back to his truck, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just been evaluated, measured, and found to be, what? A threat? An obstacle? Or maybe just another target? Mike didn't sleep well that night. Every time he started to drift off, he'd jerk awake with the sensation that someone was watching him through his bedroom window. By morning, he'd convinced himself it was just paranoia, the natural result of getting involved in something this serious. But when he went downstairs to open the shop for Mr. Gaunt, though the old man was rarely around these days, the antique business somehow kept running. Mike found something that made his blood turn to ice water. Tucked under the windshield wiper of his truck was a single photograph. It showed Emma Hutchins, very much alive, sitting on what looked like a metal cot in a room with concrete walls. She was still wearing her school clothes, still holding Mr. Hopscotch, but her face was streaked with tears, and her eyes held a terror that no 7-year-old should ever have to feel. On the back of the photograph, someone had written in neat block letters, "She's safe for now, stop looking." Mike's hands shook as he turned the photograph over again. Emma was alive. That was the important thing. But the message was clear. Someone knew he was looking for her, and they wanted him to stop, which meant he was getting close to something they didn't want found. Mike drove straight to the police station and found Detective Torgerson at his desk, looking like he'd slept about as well as Mike had. "Ray, I need to show you something." Torgerson looked at the photograph with the kind of careful attention cops reserved for evidence that might break a case. "Where did you get this?" "Someone left it on my truck overnight." "Any idea who?" Mike shook his head. "But whoever took Emma knows I'm looking for her. The question is how." Ray studied Mike's face. "You want to tell me what you're really doing, Mike? Because I've got a missing 7-year-old, no leads, and now someone's leaving photographs on your truck. That's not the kind of coincidence I believe in." Mike had known this moment would come eventually. Ray was a good cop, which meant he was going to keep pushing until he got answers. The question was how much of the truth he could handle. "I have a gift," Mike said finally. "I can find things. Lost things. I touched Emma's stuffed rabbit yesterday and saw her being taken." Ray leaned back in his chair. "You're psychic." "I don't know what I am. I just know that sometimes, when I touch something that mattered to someone, I can see where it's been. And you saw Emma being taken. By a man in a white van, just like I told you yesterday." Ray was quiet for a long moment, studying Mike's face the way he might examine a piece of evidence. Finally, he said, "My grandmother used to read tea leaves, claimed she could see the future in the pattern of leaves at the bottom of a cup. Most people thought she was crazy, but she predicted 3 deaths, 2 births, and a fire that burned down half of Main Street. Do you believe in it?" "I believe in results," Ray said. "If you can find Emma Hutchins, I don't care if you use tea leaves, crystal balls, or communication with little green men from Mars." They were interrupted by Officer Jenny Martinez, who knocked on Ray's door and stuck her head in. "Detective, we just got a call about a white panel van, found abandoned in a rest area about 20 miles north on 117. Ray was on his feet immediately. "How long has it been there?" "Groundskeeper says at least 2 days. No license plates, VIN numbers filed off. Looks like it was wiped clean." "Get a crime scene team out there," Ray said. Then, to Mike, Want to take a ride?" The rest area was one of those small roadside parks that dotted main highways, a few picnic tables, a couple of vending machines, and restrooms that smelled like industrial disinfectant and broken dreams. The white van was parked at the far end of the lot, looking innocent enough except for the complete absence of any identifying marks. Mike followed Ray and the crime scene team, staying back while they photographed and measured and dusted for fingerprints that probably weren't there. But when Ray asked if he wanted to take a look inside the van, Mike nodded. The interior was exactly as clean as they'd expected. Not a fiber, not a fingerprint, not so much as a gum wrapper. Whoever had used this van was professional, careful, experienced. But when Mike placed his hand on the driver's seat, he caught a flash of something. Emma, curled up in the back of the van, crying softly. Mr. Hopscotch nowhere to be seen, probably left behind on Pine Street. The van moving through the night, heading north, east. The vision was fragmented, unclear, and then again, that sense of being watched, of something looking back at him through the psychic connection, studying him with cold intelligence. Mike jerked his hand back as if he'd touched a live wire. "You okay?" Ray asked. "Fine, just fine." But Mike wasn't fine. Whatever had taken Emma was more than just a predator with a van and a taste for children. There was something else involved, something that could sense when Mike used his gift to track it, something that was now tracking him in return. The photograph had been a warning. "Stop looking," it said. But Mike couldn't stop, wouldn't stop, not with Emma out there somewhere, afraid and alone and depending on people like him and Ray to bring her home, which meant the game had changed. It was no longer just about finding Emma. It was about who would find whom first. That night, Mike took precautions. He drove home by a circuitous route, checking his mirrors for anyone following him. He parked his truck in the alley behind the antique shop instead of out front. He entered through the back door and checked every room in the apartment before settling down with a cup of coffee and his laptop. If there was a predator operating in this area, there would be other missing children, other families destroyed by some monster who hunted kids like Emma. Mike spent 3 hours searching through missing persons databases, police reports, and newspaper archives. What he found made him sick. Over the past 5 years, 8 children had gone missing from small towns within a 100-mile radius of Castle Rock, all between the ages of 6 and 10, all taken while walking home from school or playing in their yards, all vanished without a trace. The police in each town had investigated, but without physical evidence or witnesses, the cases had gone cold. Families had been torn apart. Parents had divorced, moved away, or drunk themselves into early graves. And somewhere out there, a monster had continued hunting. Until now. Mike printed out everything he could find about the missing children, spreading the papers across his kitchen table. 8 faces stared back at him, 4 boys, 4 girls, all with that unmistakable look of childhood innocence that should have protected them from the kind of evil that had found them instead. But as Mike studied the photographs, he began to notice patterns. The children had all been taken during the day from public places where kidnapping should have been noticed. Yet in each case, no one had seen anything suspicious. It was as if the children had simply vanished into thin air. Either their abductor was incredibly lucky, or he had some way of knowing when it was safe to strike, some way of sensing when no one was watching. Mike was beginning to suspect it was the latter. He was still studying the files when his phone rang. The caller ID showed Linda Hutchins' number. "Mike, I'm sorry to call so late, but I can't sleep. and I keep thinking about what you said, about Emma fighting back when that man took her. She's strong, Linda. That's going to help her. I know, but Mike, there's something I should have told you yesterday. Something I didn't think was important, but now I'm wondering if maybe it was. Mike sat up straighter. What is it? For the past couple of weeks, Emma kept saying she felt like someone was watching her. At school, at the playground, even here at home. I thought it was just her imagination, you know? Kids that age, they get ideas in their heads. Did she say anything else about it? Just that it made her feel scared. She started asking me to walk her to school, which she hasn't wanted since kindergarten, and she wouldn't play outside by herself anymore. Mike felt cold fingers walking up his spine. Linda, why didn't you tell the police about this? I don't know. I guess I thought it would make me sound like a paranoid mother. And it's not like Emma could describe anyone specific. She just said she felt watched. After Linda hung up, Mike sat staring at the missing children's photos spread across his table. How many of them had felt watched in the days before they disappeared? How many had tried to tell their parents about the creeping sensation of invisible eyes following their every move? And how many parents had dismissed those fears as childhood imagination? Mike was reaching for his phone to call Ray when he heard it, a soft, scratching sound coming from somewhere above his head, like fingernails dragging across wood. He looked up at the ceiling. The sound came again from the direction of his bedroom. Slow, deliberate, rhythmic. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Mike grabbed a flashlight from his kitchen drawer and climbed the stairs as quietly as he could. The scratching continued, and now he could tell it was coming from outside his bedroom window, the one that faced the alley where he'd parked his truck. He approached the window carefully, staying to one side so he wouldn't be silhouetted against the light. The scratching stopped. Mike waited, counting his heartbeats, then quickly moved to the window and looked out. The alley was empty. His truck sat where he'd left it, undisturbed. But there, scratched into the wooden frame around his window, was a message. "Stop looking, or she dies." Mike grabbed his phone and called 911, but by the time the police arrived, whoever had left the message was long gone. They took pictures, dusted for fingerprints, and promised to increase patrols in the area. But Mike could see in their eyes the same thing he'd seen in Ray's, the look cops got when they were dealing with something beyond their experience. "Any idea who might want to threaten you?" Officer Martinez asked, as she finished taking his statement. Mike almost laughed. "Someone who doesn't want me looking for Emma Hutchins. The missing girl? Why would they care what you do?" Mike had already told Ray about his gift, but he wasn't ready to explain it to the entire Castle Rock police force. "I've been helping the family. Maybe I got too close to something." Martinez nodded and made notes, but Mike could tell she thought he was just a civilian who'd gotten in over his head, which, he supposed, was probably true. After the police left, Mike stood in his bedroom staring at the scratched message. The wood was gouged deep, as if it had been carved with something very sharp, or very pointed, like claws. Mike didn't sleep that night. He sat in his living room chair with a baseball bat across his knees, watching the windows and listening to every sound the old building made as it settled around him. Twice, he thought he heard footsteps in the alley. Once, he was sure he saw a face at his kitchen window, just a pale blur that vanished the moment he looked directly at it. By morning, he'd made a decision. The warnings were escalating, which meant he was getting close to something important. But it also meant that whoever had Emma was getting desperate. Desperate people made mistakes. Mike called in sick to his regular handyman jobs and drove to the library. If there was a pattern to the kidnappings, he was going to find it. And if there was information about the kind of person who could sense when he was using his gift, he was going to find that too. The Castle Rock Public Library was a Carnegie building from the early 1900s, all dark wood and tall windows, and the kind of respectful quiet that made people whisper. Mike had spent a lot of time here as a kid, back when his mother was working 2 jobs, and he needed a safe place to do his homework. The head librarian was Sarah Morrison, Pete's daughter, who'd gone to college and come back with a degree in library science and a determination to drag Castle Rock's information services into the 21st century. She greeted Mike with a smile and a cup of coffee that was actually drinkable. "Research project?" she asked, leading him to a computer terminal. "Something like that. I need to look up information about psychic phenomena, specifically people who can sense when they're being observed through supernatural means." Sarah raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions. One of the things Mike had always liked about librarians was their professional commitment to curiosity without judgment. "Try the paranormal psychology databases," she suggested. "And there's a collection of academic papers on psychic phenomena that might be helpful. Password is Carnegie 192. Mike spent the next 4 hours reading everything he could find about psychic abilities, supernatural predators, and the intersection between the two. Most of it was garbage, New Age nonsense about crystal healing and astral projection. But buried in the academic papers, he found references to something called psychic symbiosis. According to Dr. Elizabeth Harding of the University of Vermont, psychic symbiosis occurred when 2 individuals with supernatural abilities formed an involuntary connection. The stronger psychic, usually someone with predatory intentions, could sense when the weaker one was using their gift and could track them through that connection. Think of it as a supernatural form of caller ID, Dr. Harding had written. The predator becomes aware not only that they're being observed, but by whom. Mike felt ice form in his stomach. Every time he'd used his gift to search for Emma, he'd been sending out a psychic signal that her captor could detect. The man wasn't just kidnapping children. He was hunting people like Mike, people who might be able to find him. Mike was about to close the database when another article caught his eye. This one was from the Journal of Criminal Psychology, written by an FBI profiler named Marcus Webb. The Collector, a profile of the supernatural predator, described a type of criminal that law enforcement was only beginning to understand. These individuals didn't just take victims, they collected them, keeping them alive for extended periods while feeding off their fear and despair. The article suggested that some of these predators had psychic abilities that allowed them to select victims and avoid detection. According to Webb, collectors often kept their victims in underground facilities, bunkers, basements, abandoned mine shafts, places where they could visit regularly without being observed. They were organized, intelligent, and extremely dangerous, and they were nearly impossible to catch using conventional police methods. The article included a map showing the locations of suspected collector activity over the past decade. Mike counted 17 cases across New England and the Maritime provinces. Each represented multiple victims, children who had vanished without a trace, their families left to wonder and hope, and slowly go insane with grief. One of the marked locations was less than 50 miles from Castle Rock. Mike printed out everything and drove straight to the police station. Ray was at his desk, looking like he'd been there all night. "I think I know what we're dealing with," Mike said, dropping the stack of papers on Ray's desk. Ray read through the articles with the kind of focused attention that had made him a good detective. When he finished, he looked up at Mike with grim understanding. "You're saying the guy who took Emma is some kind of supernatural serial killer. I'm saying he's a predator who collects children and has psychic abilities that let him avoid getting caught. The FBI has been tracking similar cases for years." Ray leaned back in his chair. "Okay, let's say I buy this. What's our next move?" "The article mentions an abandoned quarry about 40 miles north of here, place called Devil's Tooth. There was a case 5 years ago. 3 kids disappeared from a town nearby. FBI investigated, but never found anything concrete. You want to check it out?" "I think we have to. If Emma's being held somewhere underground, a quarry would be perfect. Deep, isolated, plenty of places to hide." Ray was quiet for a long moment, studying the map. Finally, he said, "I can't authorize an official investigation based on a hunch and some paranormal research. But I'm off duty in 2 hours. If a couple of concerned citizens wanted to take a drive and have a look around, that wouldn't be any of my business." Mike felt a surge of gratitude. Ray was putting his career on the line, all because he believed Mike might actually be able to find Emma. "There's something else," Mike said. "This guy knows I'm looking for him. He's been leaving messages, warnings. If we're right about this, he's going to be expecting us. Then we better be prepared for whatever we find up there." Ray spent the rest of his shift gathering equipment, flashlights, rope, a first aid kit, and his service weapon, which he carried in his personal capacity as a licensed gun owner rather than as a police officer. Mike went home to collect his own supplies, including a crowbar and a hammer from his toolkit. As he was loading his truck, Mike's phone rang. Linda Hutchins' number again. "Mike, I got another photograph." Mike's blood went cold. "What kind of photograph?" "Emma, but this one's different. She looks sick. Or hurt. And there's writing on the back. What does it say?" Linda's voice was barely a whisper. "Last warning. Stop looking or she dies tonight." Mike checked his watch. It was almost 3 in the afternoon. If they were going to find Emma, they had to move fast. "Linda, I want you to take that photograph to Detective Torgerson at the police station. Do it right now." "Where are you going?" "To find your daughter." The drive to Devil's Tooth took them through 40 miles of rural Maine, farmland giving way to forest. Small towns becoming scattered houses, becoming nothing but trees and stone walls that marked property lines from 100 years ago. The quarry was marked on Mike's GPS, but the road leading to it was little more than a dirt track that hadn't seen maintenance since the Clinton administration. Ray's police cruiser bottomed out twice on the ruts and rocks, scraping the undercarriage with sounds that made both men wince. "Should have taken your truck," Ray muttered, as he navigated around a washout that had probably been there since the last ice age. "Too late now," Mike said, but he was thinking about more than just the choice of vehicles. With every mile they drove deeper into the woods, he felt that familiar sensation of being watched. Whatever was waiting for them at Devil's Tooth knew they were coming. The quarry had been abandoned for at least 20 years. The access road ended at a chain-link fence that had once been topped with razor wire, though most of the wire had rusted away or been cut by hunters and kids looking for a place to drink beer and raise hell. A faded sign warned of dangerous conditions and threatened prosecution for trespassing, but the padlock on the gate had been cut long ago. Ray pushed the gate open, and they drove through into what looked like the end of the world. Devil's Tooth had been a granite quarry carved out of the hillside in great terraced steps that descended into a black pool of water maybe 200 feet below. The machinery was long gone, but the scars remained, gouges in the rock face where explosives had blasted away tons of stone, rusted cables hanging from overhead gantries like the rigging of a ghost ship, and everywhere the feeling that this place had been abandoned by God sometime around the Eisenhower administration. Jesus, Ray breathed as they parked at the edge of the main pit. If you wanted to hide something, this would be the place. Mike got out of the cruiser and immediately felt it, a psychic weight that pressed against his consciousness like a physical thing. Something had happened here, something that had left an imprint on the stone itself. Fear and pain and despair, layered like geological strata in the granite walls. "You feel that?" he asked Ray. "Feel what?" "Never mind." Mike shouldered his backpack and picked up his flashlight. "Let's find a way down." They followed a switchback path that had probably been cut for the quarry workers decades ago. The stone was slick with moss and autumn moisture. And more than once, Mike had to grab Ray's arm to keep him from sliding off the narrow ledge into the abyss below. As they descended, the walls of the quarry seemed to close in around them. The late afternoon sun barely penetrated to the bottom of the pit, leaving them in a twilight world of gray stone and black shadows. And with each step, Mike felt the psychic pressure growing stronger. Something was definitely down here. Something that had been feeding on fear for a very long time. They reached the bottom of the quarry after 20 minutes of careful climbing. The floor was a maze of fallen rock, abandoned equipment, and pools of stagnant water that reflected the sky like broken mirrors. But at the far end, carved into the quarry wall, Mike could see the black mouth of a tunnel. "That wasn't on any of the geological surveys," Ray said, checking his flashlight. "Probably cut after the quarry was abandoned," Mike replied, but he didn't believe it. The tunnel looked old, much older than the quarry itself. It looked like something that had been here long before the first dynamite blast had echoed off these walls. They approached the tunnel entrance carefully. Ray had his weapon drawn, though Mike doubted bullets would be much use against whatever they were likely to find. As they got closer, Mike could see that the tunnel extended back into darkness, and there were marks carved into the stone around the entrance, symbols that hurt to look at directly. "Mike!" Ray's voice was tight. "Look at this." Ray was kneeling beside the tunnel entrance, his flashlight beam focused on something lying in the rubble. Mike joined him and felt his heart stop. It was Mr. Hopscotch. Emma's stuffed rabbit lay on its side, one button eye missing, the fur matted with something that might have been mud but probably wasn't. Mike picked it up with shaking hands. "She's here," he whispered. "Emma's here." But when he touched the rabbit, trying to get another vision, all he felt was a psychic scream that nearly drove him to his knees. Pain and terror and despair mixed with something else, something ancient and hungry that fed on innocence the way a vampire fed on blood. And underneath it all, barely audible above the psychic noise, Mike heard a child crying. "We have to go in there," he said. Ray nodded grimly. "Stay behind me? And Mike? If things go bad, you run. Don't try to be a hero. Just get out and call for backup." They entered the tunnel with their flashlights cutting weak cones of light through the darkness ahead. The walls were carved stone, fitted together with a precision that suggested this place was much older than anyone had suspected. Every few yards, there were alcoves cut into the walls, and in each alcove, "Christ," Ray whispered. The alcoves held bones. Human bones arranged in neat piles like cordwood. Some were obviously old, yellowed with age and crumbling to dust. Others looked more recent, still bearing traces of fabric and hair. "How many?" Mike asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Ray counted alcoves with his flashlight beam. Dozens, maybe more. They kept walking, deeper into the tunnel system that seemed to extend far back into the hillside. The air grew colder as they descended, and Mike began to hear things, whispers in languages he didn't recognize, soft laughter that echoed from side passages, and always, underneath everything else, the sound of children crying. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, they came to a heavy wooden door set into the tunnel wall. It was reinforced with iron bands and secured with a lock that looked like it belonged in a medieval dungeon. But the lock was open, hanging from its hasp like an invitation. Ray and Mike exchanged glances. Then Ray pushed the door open. The room beyond was carved from living rock, circular and domed, with a pit in the center that dropped away into darkness. Around the walls were metal cages, modern constructions that looked hideously out of place in the ancient chamber. And in those cages, Emma. Mike started forward, but Ray grabbed his arm. "Wait, this is too easy." Ray was right. The door had been unlocked. The room was empty except for the children in the cages, and there was no sign of whoever had brought them here. It felt like a trap. But then, Mike saw Emma in one of the cages, curled up in a corner with her arms wrapped around her knees, and he stopped caring about traps. "Emma! Emma, it's okay. We're here to take you home." Emma's head came up, and Mike saw that her face was streaked with tears and dirt, but she was alive and alert. In the other cages, he could see more children. Some he recognized from the missing persons reports, others who must have been taken from towns too far away to make the news in Castle Rock. All of them alive. All of them staring at Mike and Ray with a mixture of hope and terror. "How do we get them out?" Mike asked, examining the cage locks. They were electronic, controlled by some kind of remote system. "Look for a control panel," Ray said, sweeping his flashlight around the room. "There has to be." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the stone walls with a sound like nails on slate. "Welcome, Mr. Torrance." Mike spun around, trying to locate the source of the voice, but the acoustics of the chamber made it impossible to pinpoint. "I've been waiting for you," the voice continued. "Ever since you first touched the little girl's toy, I've been watching you, learning about you. Do you know how rare it is to find someone with your particular gift? Let the children go," Ray called out, his weapon raised. "This is between you and us." Laughter echoed through the chamber, and Mike felt something cold touch his mind, a presence that was ancient and hungry and absolutely without human compassion. "Detective Torgerson, isn't it? I'm afraid this isn't a matter for conventional law enforcement. You see, Mr. Torrance and I have developed what you might call a professional relationship. He finds things, and I collect them." Mike felt the psychic pressure building in his skull, and suddenly he understood. The warnings, the photographs, the escalating threats, they weren't meant to scare him away. They were meant to draw him here. "You wanted me to find this place," he said. "Of course, you have a gift that could be very useful to someone in my line of work. Think of the possibilities, a partner who could locate specific children, identify which ones would be most suitable for my collection. The voice was coming closer now, and Mike could see movement in the shadows at the far end of the chamber. Something was emerging from a passage they hadn't noticed, something that moved with liquid grace and cast shadows that didn't match its apparent shape. "I'm not going to help you," Mike said. "Oh, but you are. You see, I have something you want, these children. And I'm prepared to make a trade. Join me willingly, and they go free. Refuse, and, well, I'm afraid they'll become permanent additions to my collection." Ray fired 3 quick shots at the moving shadow, but the bullets seemed to pass right through it without effect. The laughter came again, closer now. "Bullets won't work on me, Detective. I'm not entirely physical anymore. Decades of feeding on fear and despair have changed me, evolved me into something your conventional weapons can't touch." Mike saw it then, the thing that had been stalking children across New England for years. It had once been human, but whatever humanity it possessed had been burned away by supernatural hunger, leaving behind something that was part man, part predator, and part living shadow. The Collector. You have 10 seconds to decide, Mr. Torrance. Join me, or watch these children die one by one while you listen to their screams. Mike looked at Emma, at the other children in their cages, at Ray standing beside him with an empty gun and determination in his eyes that said he'd fight this thing with his bare hands if necessary. And then he made his choice. "Okay," Mike said. "I'll do it. I'll help you. Just let the children go." "Mike, no," Ray said. But Mike was already walking toward the Collector, his hands raised in surrender. As he got closer, he could see the thing more clearly, humanoid but wrong, with 2 long limbs and fingers that ended in claws, and eyes that reflected light like an animal's. "A wise choice," the Collector said. "You'll find working with me very educational." Mike nodded and kept walking until he was close enough to see the individual scales on the creature's skin, close enough to smell the decay that clung to it like perfume, close enough to touch it. "Just one thing," Mike said, and grabbed the Collector's arm. The psychic feedback hit him like a freight train. Suddenly, he was seeing everything, every child this thing had taken, every moment of fear and pain it had fed on, every death it had caused over the decades of its existence. The visions came in a torrent that threatened to drive him insane. But Mike held on, digging deeper, searching for the one thing he needed to know. Where the control system was hidden. There, behind a loose stone in the wall, a remote device that controlled the cage locks. Mike saw it clearly in the Collector's memories, saw the creature using it to open and close the cages at will. But the psychic connection worked both ways, and as Mike invaded the creature's mind, it was invading his. He felt its hunger, its alien intelligence, its complete lack of anything resembling human emotion. And he felt it learning about him, about his daughter Jessica, about his ex-wife, about everyone he'd ever cared about. "Interesting," the Collector said, its claws digging into Mike's arm. "I see you have a child of your own. Perhaps when we're finished here, we'll pay her a visit." Mike felt something snap inside his head. The psychic connection exploded outward, fueled by rage and protective instinct and every ounce of power he'd spent years keeping, carefully controlled. For one blazing moment, I and the Collector were locked together in a battle of wills that shook the stone foundations of the chamber. The creature screamed and tried to pull away, but Mike held on, pouring everything he had into the connection. Through the link, he felt the Collector's pain and confusion, It had never encountered another psychic who could fight back, never faced an opponent who could match its mental strength. And in that moment of the creature's distraction, Ray moved. The detective had spotted the loose stone Mike had seen in his vision. While the collector was focused on its psychic battle, Ray pried the stone free and grabbed the remote control hidden behind it. Electronic locks disengaged with a series of clicks that echoed through the chamber. Cage doors swung open, and suddenly the room was full of running children, all heading for the tunnel entrance and freedom. The collector realized what was happening and tried to break free from Mike's psychic grip, but Mike held on with desperate strength. "Ray, get the kids out of here." "What about you?" Mike felt his connection with the collector beginning to weaken. The creature was too strong, too experienced in psychic combat. In a few more seconds, it would break free, and then all of them would die. But Mike had one more card to play. Instead of trying to fight the collector, he opened his mind completely, dropping every defense he'd ever built, letting the creature's alien consciousness pour into his head like acid. The pain was indescribable, but it accomplished what he needed. It created a feedback loop that trapped them both in an endless cycle of shared consciousness. "Run!" Mike screamed, blood running from his nose and ears. "I can't hold it much longer." Ray herded the children toward the tunnel entrance, but Emma broke away from the group and ran back toward Mike. "Emma, no!" But the little girl dodged Ray's reaching hands and threw herself at Mike, wrapping her small arms around his waist. "I won't leave you," she said. "You came to find me, and I won't leave you." The moment Emma touched him, something extraordinary happened. Her innocent love and gratitude flowed through the psychic connection, and Mike felt his strength return. More than that, he felt the collector recoil in pain and disgust. The creature fed on fear and despair, but Emma's pure emotion was like poison to it. Other children were running back now, all of them reaching for Mike, all of them adding their gratitude and hope to the psychic maelstrom. And the collector, which had fed on negative emotions for so long, found itself drowning in love and trust, and the kind of innocent faith that children possessed. "No," it screamed. "No, this isn't possible." But it was possible. The creature had spent decades becoming a predator that fed on darkness, and now it was being force-fed light. Mike felt its consciousness fragmenting, its stolen power beginning to unravel. "Everyone out!" Mike shouted. "Now, while it's weak." This time, the children listened. They ran for the tunnel entrance with Ray right behind them, but Mike stayed where he was, maintaining the psychic connection that was keeping the collector trapped. "Mike, come on!" Ray called from the doorway. "I can't let go. If I break the connection, it'll come after us. Then we'll face it together." But Mike knew better. The moment he released his psychic grip, the collector would recover, and all of this would have been for nothing. The children would die. Ray would die. And the creature would continue hunting for decades to come. Unless Mike made sure it couldn't. He reached deeper into the psychic connection, past the collector's consciousness, down to the very foundations of its existence. There, buried beneath layers of supernatural evolution, he found what he was looking for, the human core that the creature had once been. A man named David Marsh, who had lost his own child to a drunk driver 40 years ago, and had made a deal with something dark and hungry in exchange for the power to make other parents feel his pain. Mike touched that human core with all the compassion he could muster, and David Marsh remembered what it felt like to love someone more than your own life. The collector screamed as its stolen power turned inward, consuming itself in a feedback loop of guilt and remorse and long-buried humanity. Mike felt the creature's consciousness collapse, felt its physical form beginning to dissolve, and then, mercifully, the psychic connection snapped. Mike collapsed to his knees, blood streaming from his nose and ears, his head feeling like it had been split open with an axe. But when he looked up, the collector was gone. Nothing remained but a pile of dust and the lingering smell of decay. Ray was beside him in an instant, helping him to his feet. "Is it over?" Mike nodded weakly. "It's over." They made their way out of the tunnel system, following the sound of children's voices echoing off the stone walls. By the time they reached the surface, the sun was setting, and the quarry was full of police cars, ambulances, and FBI agents who had somehow materialized out of the gathering darkness. Mike never did find out how the cavalry had arrived so quickly, but he suspected Linda Hutchins had something to do with it. A mother's intuition was a powerful thing, and she'd probably known the moment Emma was safe. The reunion at the quarry's edge was everything Mike had hoped it would be. Emma flew into her mother's arms like a small missile, and for a long moment the two of them simply held each other and cried. The other children were reunited with their families over the following hours, as parents drove through the night from towns across New England to reclaim sons and daughters they thought were lost forever. Mike sat on the hood of Ray's cruiser, watching the controlled chaos and trying to ignore the paramedic, who insisted on checking his vital signs every 5 minutes. His head still felt like it had been used for batting practice, but he was alive and the children were safe, and that was enough. "Hell of a thing," Ray said, settling beside him with a cup of coffee that someone had somehow procured in the middle of nowhere. "Yeah, the FBI's going to want to debrief you, probably for days." Mike nodded. He'd expected that. What he'd found in the tunnels beneath Devil's Tooth was going to rewrite everything law enforcement thought they knew about certain types of predators. You going to be okay with that? Talking about your gift, I mean. Mike thought about it for a moment. For 34 years he'd kept his ability secret, afraid of being labeled a freak or a fraud. But tonight, that gift had saved 8 children's lives. "Yeah," he said, "I think I'll be okay with it." Emma appeared at his elbow, still clutching her mother's hand, but looking much more like the fearless little girl she'd been before this nightmare began. "Mr. Mike, I wanted to say thank you. You don't need to thank me, sweetheart. I'm just glad you're okay." Emma studied his face with the serious expression children sometimes wore when they were trying to understand adult things. "The bad man said you were special, that you could find things. That's right. Are you going to keep finding things? Lost things?" Mike looked around at the other children, at their parents, at the law enforcement officials who were probably going to be calling him for help with cases that conventional investigation couldn't solve. "Yeah," he said, "I think I am." Emma nodded, as if that made perfect sense. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out something that made Mike's heart skip a beat. It was Mr. Hopscotch's missing button eye. "I found this in one of the cages," she said, holding it out to him. "I thought maybe you could find him a way to get it back where it belongs." Mike took the small button and immediately felt a flash of vision. Emma, in her bedroom at home, carefully sewing the eye back onto her beloved rabbit, making him whole again. "I think that's something you're going to have to do yourself," Mike said, handing the button back to her. "Some things are too important to trust to anyone else." Emma smiled and tucked the button safely back into her pocket. Then she hugged Mike one more time before running back to her mother. Mike watched them walk away toward Linda's car, and for the first time in years, he felt like he knew exactly what he was supposed to be doing with his life. Finding lost things, bringing them home, using his gift not to hide from the world, but to make it a little bit safer for people like Emma. It was, Mike thought, a pretty good way to spend whatever time he had left. His phone buzzed with a text message. Jessica, his daughter, checking in from her mother's house in Portland. Saw the news. Are you okay, Dad? Mike smiled as he typed back, I'm fine, honey. Better than fine, actually. Love you. Love you too. Maybe we could have dinner next weekend? Just us? Mike looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky and felt something that had been broken inside him for a very long time finally start to heal. I'd like that very much. Ray appeared beside him again. Ready to head back to town? The FBI can wait until tomorrow for their debrief. Mike slid off the hood of the cruiser and looked back one more time at the quarry that had hidden so much darkness for so long. In the morning, crime scene techs would be swarming all over the tunnel system, cataloging evidence and trying to identify the remains they'd found. But tonight, it was just a hole in the ground, no longer threatening, no longer hungry, just empty. Yeah, Mike said, let's go home. As they drove back toward Castle Rock, Mike's phone rang again. This time, it was a number he didn't recognize. Mr. Torrance, this is Agent Sarah Chen with the FBI. I'm calling about what happened tonight. Mike almost laughed. Dr. Chen from his therapy sessions had a sister in the FBI. The world was smaller than he'd thought. I assume you're going to want to talk to me. Actually, Mr. Torrance, I was hoping you might want to talk to us. The Bureau has a unit that specializes in cases like this one, crimes that involve supernatural elements. We could use someone with your particular abilities. Mike looked out at the Maine countryside rolling past in the darkness, at the small towns where families were sleeping peacefully because 8 children who should have been dead were safely home. What would that involve? Consulting work, mostly. When we encounter cases that conventional investigation can't solve, we'd call you in. The pay is good, and you'd be helping a lot of people. Can I think about it? Of course. But Mr. Torrance, what you did tonight, that took courage. The world needs more people willing to stand up to the darkness. After Agent Chen hung up, Mike sat in comfortable silence while Ray navigated the winding roads back to town. The detective's radio crackled occasionally with routine calls, domestic disputes, traffic accidents, the normal chaos of human existence that didn't involve ancient predators or psychic battles. It was a good sound, normal, safe. You going to take the FBI job? Ray asked. Maybe. What do you think? Ray considered it for a moment. I think you've got a gift that could help a lot of people. And I think tonight proved you're brave enough to use it. They reached the outskirts of Castle Rock as the church bells were chiming midnight. In a few hours, the sun would rise on a town where 8 families had been made whole again, where a monster that had stalked children for decades was finally at rest. Mike's phone buzzed with one more message. This one was from Linda Hutchins. Emma's asleep in her own bed, holding Mr. Hopscotch. She says to tell you that she fixed his eye, and he can see perfectly now. Thank you for bringing our little girl home. Mike smiled and put his phone away. Tomorrow, he'd have to deal with FBI debriefings and media attention, and probably 100 phone calls from people who wanted his help finding their own lost things. But tonight, he was just Mike Torrance, driving home through the darkness with his friend, thinking about his daughter and the dinner they'd share next weekend. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Ray dropped him off at the antique shop, and Mike climbed the stairs to his apartment, feeling lighter than he had in years. The gift he'd spent so long hiding was finally going to be used for something good, something important. As he unlocked his door, Mike thought he heard something. A sound like children laughing, carried on the wind from somewhere far away. But when he stopped to listen, there was only the normal nighttime sounds of a small town settling into sleep. Mike went inside and closed the door behind him. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new cases, new opportunities to help people find what they'd lost. But tonight, 8 children were safe at home, and that was the best gift of all.